Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. This is Season 13, Episode 20, and I'm your host, Dean Jones. Today we have a returning guest, the amazing Douglas Weissman. He's back to chat about his brand new book, Girl in the Ashes, which is out now and is sure to captivate listeners. Beyond being a captivating author, Douglas is a seasoned travel writer who has explored diverse corners of the globe. He's also a husband and a father and a Los Angeles resident with a fascinating background. He holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of San Francisco and even spent time in Buenos Aires. But that's not all. Douglas has worn many hats throughout his life, working in a safari game reserve, settling timeshares, and even editing nonfiction books. When he's not traveling, writing, and indulging in his love of food, Douglas loves crafting characters with enduring flaws and surprising resilience. His first book, Life Between Seconds, came out in 2022 and left a lasting impression. We're thrilled to have Douglas back on the show today to delve into his latest work, Girl in the Ashes. I'll now take you to my conversation with Douglas Weissman. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones, and today I'm talking again to author Douglas Weissman. We've had him before on the podcast, and he's always a great guest, and I love having him back. Doug, for our listeners who don't remember your interview or haven't listened to it before, can you talk a little bit about yourself? Tell us about where you're from, and your previous book, and then can we go a little bit into your current book, Girl in the Ashes?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back. I hope that means that you liked me the first time.
Absolutely.
So my name is Douglas Weissman. I was born and raised in the Los Angeles area. I've lived all over the world, including in the Bay Area, which I love dearly. I went to grad school in the Bay Area, and it kind of informed a lot of, well, not just grad school, but the Bay Area in general, informed a lot of how I write, why I write, and enabled me to understand kind of my own obsessions. And with that, I am a travel writer, and that is one of my obsessions, traveling, but I am also a novelist. My other obsession is just figuring out beautiful language, not necessarily that inaccessible, but how to create connection through beauty in language and word choice, and even making things incredibly inorganic. So something that might seem beautiful and flowery and flowy and get you involved in one way can suddenly become abrupt or grotesque without you realizing it or thinking that it's going to go that direction. Those were connections I made when I was in San Francisco in my grad program. With my recent novel, or my previous novel, Life Between Seconds, those were some of the things I wanted to explore through the relationship of Sophia, who's a 74-year-old Argentinian woman, and Peter, who's a 25-year-old American guy, and the friendship that they forge while trying to escape the nightmares of their past until those nightmares catch up with them and they have to decide, are they going to try and save themselves through their friendship or continue running away and remain broken?
I love that. All right. So can you do a breakdown a little bit and talk about the book, Girl in the Ashes, and tell our listeners what exactly the book is about, kind of give us some insight on the characters and talk about the plot line a little bit.
Absolutely. Girl in the Ashes takes place in World War II occupied Paris, but we follow Odette Lefebvre, who's a serial killer. And she's been a serial killer since before the occupation, and she's able to use the occupation as kind of a veil to continue finding her victims and supporting her extracurricular activities, let's say. It's, in a way, in at least my own way, kind of a Trojan horse in the Holocaust education. There are so many Holocaust books out there, or World War II books out there, and I appreciate all of them. But one of the things that I understand is that a lot of them can take a similar perspective of, here is somebody who's in a tough spot and has to decide whether they're going to do the morally right thing or not. And they generally do. Where I wanted to start with somebody who's already in a morally gray area and then make it questionable whether you're going to follow her down what path and whether that path is actually morally right or wrong, given her starting point. Right? So how do you root for a serial killer? Well, hopefully this is one that you can root for, in a similar question to, say, Dexter, right? He's a serial killer that with a heart of gold, even though technically he's got no heart.
Right.
So we have Odette, who's our main character, the serial killer. We have Aloysius, who is a longtime friend and even companion, somewhat romantic interest, if they could ever get their shit together long enough to move forward. And that's on purpose because they both have their own baggage. We have Agnes, who was Odette's mother's best friend, also Aloysius's mother. And we have Ilse, who is a new doctor at the hospital Odette works at. She's also German and put in place to do research and discovery at that hospital and also to run the hospital, the daily ins and outs and things. With the kind of ragtag collection of these characters, you just see the different ways everybody tries to survive the times, the different goals each of them have, both large scale and personal, but also how everybody's story intertwines, even in limited ways, but how everybody's action affects another, even if they don't expect it to, even if it's supposed to be taking them away from another person, the action still affects them in some way or another. So these are all things that I love to explore, part of that obsession that I talked about earlier.
I really, in reading this and reading the book, I really had an idea that this was something that was very complex and probably took a lot of thinking to think the whole thing out. How long did you work on the novel? How long was it percolating in your head?
Yeah, well, surprisingly, everything you said is absolutely true. However, it surprisingly took less time than my previous novel, which took 11 years from
Yeah.
first thought of it to research to writing to editing to actually getting published. This one only took about 5 years through that entire process, from first idea to research to writing to publication. But it still did take a lot of different type of focus. I understood how to write this type of novel better, given my experience with the previous one. And I understood my own writing style and my own editing style better. So it's not that I knew how to write better, it's just that I understood myself better in order to move through it a little faster.
I'm a big fan of many mystery thriller writers who write about serial killers. I read a lot of them. I watch a lot of TV shows, particularly like Hannibal. I've seen the Silence of the Lambs films, and I'm kind of a fan. Weirdly, I mean, I know it's a weird thing to say, but I really kind of love the genre. Odette is a real kind of different take because it's a female serial killer, which is almost never done. Was this tough to write as an author?
It was and it wasn't, which I really hesitate saying about the wasn't part because it should always be hard to write a serial killer, I hope.
Yeah,
But what happened was my wife and I had never seen Dexter, and my wife was really, she loved the show.
yeah.
We were watching it together, and I found it truly compelling. And then we were at my cousin's wedding up for a weekend in the Central Wine region in California. And she just had this thought, oh, what if there was a serial killer in World War II Paris? Because we love Paris. We're kind of that time. We love kind of swing music and all these time periods that we share. So I was like, oh, that would be interesting. And then making her a female just seems so much more compelling because of what you said, right? Hannibal, Dexter, Silence of the Lambs. We have so many serial killers that are focused on men. And of course, statistically, right, more serial killers are men, or at least more that have been caught have been men, and the documentaries around them. And I thought originally Odette was supposed to be a different type of character. She was supposed to be a sociopath. She was supposed to be removed from society, but that was where I struggled the most. How do I write this character? How do I follow this character? How do I make her so connective and connecting that people will want to follow her as well? And I couldn't do it if she was a sociopath. So I had to kind of give her these tendencies of leaning into her sociopathy in a way. So, does she like killing? Not necessarily. However, does she like the power and justice that comes along, or that sense of justice that comes along with those she chooses to kill? Yes, that is where she leans into the dark side. And that's where I felt people could actually get on board with it in a way. If she feels and can justify to the reader that she is killing this one person because they deserve it, people can get on board with that, especially given her own tragic history that feeds that desire. And through those, I felt like it was my window into creating and writing and connecting with this type of person who's doing bad things for questionable reasons, where I could not get close to her and write her if she was just a sociopath. I just couldn't do it. Just wasn't
Right.
something I could connect with. And if I can't connect, I can't do the writing. But the hardest part for me was probably the research. One, learning about serial killers and just the deeds that have taken place, but also you get into this space where I just yesterday, I read a little bit on Bob Hoskins, who was in, I mean, such a great actor, phenomenal actor, but he
Yeah.
was also the star in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And it was about
Yeah.
him when he was filming Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It was 14-hour days. He was acting by himself for most parts, pretending that these cartoon characters were there. So he had to hallucinate in a way. And he said that it really did a psychological damage on him. For a whole year, he couldn't take another part because he kept seeing cartoons popping out of walls and things.
Yeah.
Right. And so I was worried about that, spending all this time with serial killers, watching documentaries, doing the research, whether online or in actual books from libraries, because libraries are my best resource and my best friend.
Thank you for that plug.
Yeah. But it became there were moments when I had to pull myself out, and I had to pull myself out quick and hard and be like, let's just dive into a bunch of Teletubby reruns because
Yeah.
I need something completely different.
I like that. How does the harsh reality of Nazi-occupied Paris influence Odette's decisions and actions?
That was one of my biggest concerns when I was starting to write this was I did not want to make her or it a typical here come the Nazis, therefore she decides to fight them type story. And
Right.
yet, especially because she is a serial killer, and therefore the expectation would be she just dives in and uses her skills like Liam Neeson in Taken to
Right.
start taking Nazis down because it had to be more personal than that. Like she has no skin in the game in terms of when the Nazis come into Paris, other than her being Parisian, what would be her point? What would be the purpose of her killing Nazis when they're not really fitting into the mold that she has set for herself and the rules she's created to not get caught and all of these things. But at the same time, there had to be this push-pull in a way, the hero's journey, the hero always has to refuse the journey before they finally go out and take that step. But there has to be that call to action a second time, something that propels them in that direction.
Yeah.
And that was the main thing. I had to make sure that she would refuse it for long enough until something switched in her. And what would be that switch? So what are those pieces there? Absolutely. Did it need to take place in occupied Paris in World War II, this story? Absolutely. But they're not, it's not necessarily from page one, she's going to start killing Nazis, right? It's not like Inglorious Bastards, even
Right.
though that would be another fun take on it.
Yeah. Now, she targets specifically men. What criteria does she use to decide who deserves to die?
Generally, well, one, it is always men.
Yeah.
But beyond that, they have to be doing something that is, in her opinion, more than just poor taste. They have to be beating their daughter is a perfect example. And that's even from page one, you find out immediately that that's what she's doing. She is murdering, no spoiler, again, this is on page one. She's murdering a guy who beats his daughter.
Right.
And she murders men who kill women and men who basically abuse women in some manner. And part of that, or the biggest part of that, is because of her own history and the way that it shaped her perspective of men, relationships, and humanity as well.
Now, the book is described as a Trojan horse for Holocaust education. How does Girl in the Ashes offer a fresh perspective of this historical period?
Right. So, as I mentioned earlier, the biggest reason why I wanted it to be a Trojan horse was because of all the other types of stories out there that take place in this time period that kind of put that easy template in a way onto the decisions the main character makes, where I felt like this could be an attention grabber for people who like true crime but aren't necessarily into historical fiction, as well as people who like historical fiction but are interested in seeing it in a bit of a different way. And part of that way is looking at what's taking place in Paris or a major city, which is different than what took place in concentration camps, different than what took place in, say, the Netherlands, which was occupied in a different way than what Paris was, or say Kirsten Hanna's was it the Goldfinch, which took place kind of in Paris
Yep.
for a bit, but also in the south of France. So you get a very different take on what the south of France experienced and when they had farms and could eat even minimally, they had better access to food and crops.
Yeah.
So I thought all these pieces came together to just put a different perspective, as well as if somebody is Jewish inside of Paris or suspected of being Jewish or suspected of being a communist or a socialist, somebody who's an undesirable from the Nazi perspective, what would that be like? And on top of that, what is the actual effect the Nazis had on running Paris at the time? And that I think is the biggest disconnect. And part of what I wanted to show as well is that the expectation for so many who don't necessarily have an education or an understanding of that time period at the place was that the Nazis generally left Paris alone to be governed by its own source of government. And it was
Yeah.
just presence. And so maybe well, not maybe, they definitely took advantage of, say, a status of saying, we're German, so we have access to the cream, we have access to the food, those types of things, to petrol. But at the same time, a lot of the atrocities that took place under the power of the Parisian government and the French government, not
Yeah.
Germans. And so that's another thing that I wanted to be able to demonstrate. And hence, again, that Trojan horse into the education of Holocaust history.
That's wonderful. I don't think enough people, I mean, I've read some recent books that talk about the Vichy government and how their own people were, it wasn't just the Nazis doing stuff, it was the French actually doing atrocities. And it's just so horrifying to read that stuff. Now you mentioned the dark city of lights. Can you describe the atmosphere you've created for Paris under Nazi rule with the kind of Vichy government and everything going on?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest things is I wanted to demonstrate that disparity between the power that was versus the power that wasn't. So again, that idea of Germans having petrol, having cars, having access to cream, having access to real coffee,
Yeah.
because Paris was considered this crown jewel on Nazi occupied lands.
Yeah.
And with that, it meant that it was a tourist destination for Germans, especially
Yeah.
German soldiers. It was a place where German soldiers, after coming from the front or having some sort of time off, would go to explore with maps and see the Eiffel Tower and see the museums. So even while occupied, for one group of people, it was a completely different experience than, say, those Parisians, French Parisians who were living there at the time and not having access to the things they normally did, including just food, because even food was so scarce that there were pamphlets on not to eat the cats because people were getting disease because they were eating cats, or the rats as well, the pigeons, of course. And people were trying to farm rabbits on their balconies, but rabbit meat, because it's so lean, actually made people burn more calories rather than satiated them because it was so hard to process the meat internally,
Right.
which was, I thought, such a fascinating piece of information that I had to like slip it in the book somewhere.
Yeah.
Right.
That's crazy to think
Yeah.
of, weird details like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And those weird details make, to me, I feel the weirder the detail, the truer the story feels. And there are some moments where I read, and maybe other people might find it with this book, but there are some moments where something seems so out of place, not out of place, but so out of the ordinary, let's say. So it fits within the story that's being told, but it's like, wow, that's such an interesting detail, or that's such a unique perspective that it makes me think that must be true, right? Something about that, like that must have happened in this person's life and they had to fit it in here in some way, or it's an interesting fact that has to be true because it's so out there that to be called on that BS, right? To somebody be like, oh, that's got to be BS because it's so weird. And nope, the weirder, normally the truer, I find.
No, I mean, it's important because, I think the best novels are ones where you really get a real picture. And oftentimes, I think in the past, I remember like in the 70s, a similar novel would have just glossed over it all and you would have had like a superficial idea of it and it would never have seemed real. And I think this stuff makes it real. How
Mhm.
does the daily struggles for survival during this time period shape the character's actions and motivations, do you think?
Oh, I mean, without these daily struggles, I feel like the people wouldn't be motivated to act at all. I mean,
Yeah.
part of the larger story. If things were still comfortable, why would anybody choose for it to be hard, right?
Yeah.
So for instance, Odette, part of her thing is her structure. And she has a structure for going to work, coming home. She has a structure for the way that she hunts those that she feels deserving. She has a criteria list for what they have to be doing and how long she follows them to make sure that they are fitting that criteria. So everything comes down to her own structure. And this occupation completely throws that structure away. Without it, it can just quickly devolve into chaos. However, if it didn't affect her structure, she never would have to make the choice of whether to engage with the Ilsa, the doctor at the hospital, or whether to engage with Nazis in general. She could just carry on, keep her head down, and make sure that she is not in any danger because of the safety measures she's already put in place. So it's like she's forced to engage. And that's part of what I think a good novel does, is it kind of forces the characters to interact in a way. They can't just be passive. They have to make decisions, whether they're good or bad, whether it's what you want them to make or not. They have to make a decision.
Can we talk a little bit about the relationship between the Dr. Ilsa and Odette, and how does this relationship develop? How does this impact Odette's choices?
I wanted Ilse, the German doctor, to be a representation of what Odette could become if she chooses to, if she goes down that path. And so it's a bit of an echo, yet at the same time, uh, was it a sliding door, right? If you take this path, you'll end up like this. But if you take this path, you could end up like this. And it's up to Odette to make those decisions. It's just a matter of whether she can pull herself back from the brink in time or not. And Ilsa is she comes from a similar background in a way. So she's older and she's German, but at the same time she has a troubled backstory. She is really interested in how things work. She's interested in she's interested in the ends, not the means. So if she's committing atrocities, let's say, it's not because she doesn't look at people or things as people versus things. It's because she is thinking that this one person is a step to fix this larger issue. So think of how many people this one person I kill now is going to help in the future.
I like that.
And that's what I needed it to be. It's not that I want people to like Ilsa. It's just a matter of if you can justify this, you can justify anything. And is Odette willing to justify that further?
Yeah, I like that. You mentioned the secrets held by those close to Odette. Can you explore how these secrets would play out in the story and affect the characters' dynamics?
Absolutely. With Aloysius is, a somewhat romantic interest, best friend type, but at the same time, he's a coward. And part of his arc is having to either come to term with his cowardice or having to try and break free from that cloak of cowardice. But he's been a coward his whole life. So why now, and how will that affect him? How can he break free of that? But it's not necessarily in the way you would expect. Because once somebody without power is given power, how are they going to use it? And that's really the question with him. And the secret he keeps from Odette is, how is he using that power that he's given now? And would she approve of it? With Agnes, it's all about, she seems crotchety, and she is crotchety, let's be frank. But at the same time, what is she using her power for? Because she's always had a kind of soft power, and she's always been, as a woman, hidden behind the scenes. And now that she's old and a woman, is she noticeable? So she finds herself very early on, this isn't a spoiler as well, feeling invisible or being invisible. And therefore, what can she do, and where would she put that ability if she is invisible at this time in Paris? And so those are two ways, and the secrets that they're keeping from Odette, where they're entangled. They're all entangled in this web because they know each other, because everybody knows that they're seen together, because of these friendships, these relationships. Therefore, if they get caught doing these things, keeping these secrets from each other, they're all in it together, even if they don't want to be, even if they don't realize it.
I like that because I mean it's just I really liked It's so unique. I think this is not a typical book in many ways. It's so many ways, but like I love that aspect of the story. For me, that was kind of one of the most exciting things, and I've never really seen something like that done before. So I really like that quite a bit.
Thank
What
you.
messages do you hope readers will take away from Girl in the Ashes?
Ooh, that's a good one. I didn't write in the hope that people would take a message away, right? Because I feel like things can get a bit pedantic if I was trying to write to a
Yeah,
message. Yeah. But at the same time, I can't say that there isn't a message in the end that I hope they don't glean from it. And it's really about that idea of again kind of acceptance. How far are you willing to go? The morally gray areas, the nuance of things. And especially in the world today, there's
yeah,
so much nuance missed. And I'm not saying there's a side to take. And that's the whole point. There's not necessarily one side versus other side, bad versus good. It's that there's such nuance involved that people are passing over or ignoring because they want the quick sound bite that can sum it all up. And that doesn't really exist. And I felt like this needed to demonstrate, or this book was supposed to demonstrate that feeling even before this was published or written, before the world is what it is, but the nuance and the importance of nuance was still there. And I feel like this book is kind of speaking to that, right? It's are you willing to support a serial killer because they're killing people that you don't necessarily like, but they're still killing people? So is it
yeah.
justice? Is it retribution? Is it right? So there's nuance here that you can discuss as nuance because of that, which just opening up that idea of conversation, I think, is paramount for getting past the screaming at each other.
Well, I mean, I think it's something that's important because as a fan of like this genre, I liked Dexter a lot, and I liked Hannibal Lecter a lot, and I liked Odette a lot. But like, they are killing people. I mean, if you knew somebody who was doing this, we can suspend the disbelief because it's a book. But like, if you had a friend that's like, "Oh yeah, I'm a serial killer," you'd be like, "Wait, what?"
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's interesting because like these characters are very infectious, and Odette's no exception. I mean, she's a very likable character. But like, how was that for you as a writer? Like, was that a struggle for you to write that?
It was a struggle because of exactly what you're saying. I wanted people to like her. I wanted people to be willing to follow her through the story. So I had to make her, at least in a way, have the ability to connect, right? Otherwise,
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily need people to like her, right? Likability is a questionable thing, but I needed people to be willing to follow her through the story. And if she was too unlikable from the get-go, I worried that people would put the story down after page two. So there just had to be something. But I did think of one of the things I did think of is one of my favorite movies is Grosse Point Blank, which
Ah, great movie. Yeah.
amazing movie. But it's towards the beginning of the movie, he's with his therapist, and he's just trying to have a therapy session, but the therapist is kind of sitting there and be like, "No, I'm not your therapist. I told you I wasn't your therapist. You made me uncomfortable," even though he's right, because I know what you do. I know you kill people for a living. It's like, yeah, but I'm not gonna kill you unless somebody pays me enough for it. The therapist, that makes me uncomfortable. I don't, why would you say that to me? And that's kind of how I felt about the whole serial killer thing. And what you mentioned, if you have a friend who's a serial killer, it's going to make you uncomfortable, even if they
Yeah.
have parameters, right? Like
Yeah.
Dexter, oh, no, I only kill bad people. It's like, right, but what's the qualification? Because if I shoplifted when I was 17, does that put me in your purview? Are you going to come after me now?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, you still have doubts a little bit. Like, I mean, Hannibal Lecter is the outlier where you would never be comfortable with him necessarily because he's scary as shit. But like Dexter, you're like, still a little uncomfortable, even though I like you.
Yeah. It's like, let's just share a Cubano once a month, but not see each other outside.
Um, what about the title? I want to ask about the title, Girl in the Ashes. How did you, I mean, was it a struggle to find a good title for the book, or did you always have that?
It came actually the working title for a long time was Paris Dexter. That was how I titled it because it was in Paris and Dexter was on my mind because of everything that we talked about. So that was my working title, but it wasn't really until I was reading an article that was actually a joke. It was a bit of a joke article talking about how I think it was 2015 maybe or 2016. Every book that was a bestseller at the time, not every, but I'm hyperbolizing. So many books
Yeah.
were, girl on the train, girl in X, girl, right? Girl was just in the title, and somebody typed uh something like that into a title generator, and it was a girl on the plane, but the grassy plane. And it was
Yeah.
like, oh, yeah, I'd read that, right? Just by title alone. And but that was in my mind. I was reading it. I thought it was really funny. But at the same time, with Odette, I just felt like that type of title spoke to this type of story. And then with her and the way she was hiding bodies, which was actually, I'll tell you, the hardest thing for me was to figure out how to get her to hide the bodies in a believable way, living in a city. I originally just had her throwing the bodies in the sand. And I was like, that's just too basic. And so many people would be able to see it happening. So I figured out, is it possible to have a kiln, throw, uh, kind of dissect the bodies, throw it in the kiln, let it burn away? How hot do you have to make it for the fat and skin to burn off? What remains? What do you do with the remains? So like the teeth or any lingering bone shards, what do you do with that? And I, that was part of the creepiest research that I did. But it was also a lot of fun because there are also startups and companies that take not all, but part of ash and put it into glazes or things for keepsakes from family members or pets or loved, right? So I talked to some artists that were doing that, and they kind of helped guide me if it's possible and how to do it and what it would take.
See,
And
I love that because I always thought about having my ashes made into an ashtray just because I like puns.
yeah,
And just I love the idea of the ashtray because that's what that's made out of. And just.
it's perfect because it is an ashtray. Absolutely. Even if no one's
Yeah.
smoking, it is a tray of made
Yeah.
of ash, which is perfect. And but that's what got me to the idea of girl in the ashes, because she makes the the ashes into other things, and then also those things return to ash eventually as well. So circularity tickled me.
It's kind of a rehabilitation. She's making something better out of somebody, which is kind of nice.
Right. Something useful out of somebody who was useless.
It's kind of she's doing a service.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Odette's a really likable character, and I think you're going to probably get this. I know you've already gotten this already. So what about the idea of sequels or continuations of the story?
Actually, no, I haven't gotten that. With the exception of my dad asking me once, like, is there more? And so, I mean, I guess in that way I've gotten it, but not in kind of official question capacity. There was no sequel in the mind directly with Odette. However, I had actually started, before I ever started Girl in the Ashes, I'd started a different book that took place in south of France in World War II and was loosely based around and I apologize if anybody speaks French who's listening to this, because I'm probably going to butcher the name of this town, but the Ordo-sur-Glane massacre in the south of France, about maybe 45 minutes outside of Bordeaux, and where the Nazis, in a reciprocation of a underground strike, they round up everybody and put them into a church or a barn. I think it was a barn, and they burn the barn down.
Oh my God.
And so there was like one or two survivors. And so I was kind of writing it based on that. And it was a girl who was Jewish, but she was hiding out as a Catholic orphan in this church. And then similar themes, because again, back to the idea of obsession, I kind of write to these obsessions that I have. So I was writing that, but I got stuck on it. And then when I was writing that, my wife had the idea of the serial killer in Paris. And then I also learned that there was an actual serial killer in Paris in World War II who was preying on the weak. So he was basically telling Jews or communists, socialists, those who wanted to get out of Paris, that he could get them papers. And he was a doctor. So he had all of this, the ability to get more medication, which like a tranquilizer or some sort of poison. They'd go to his apartment to get the papers, and then he would murder them, steal their papers, steal their money, steal whatever he could off of them, and then bury them in his courtyard. And I
Oh my
thought, oh,
God.
wow. So that kind of helped feed into the idea, oh my goodness, this is possible, this story. So I took a tangent with Girl in the Ashes. However, in Girl in the Ashes, there is a character who was originally from the other book. And I was like, okay, so if I do it, it's going to be a loose trilogy where here's Girl in the Ashes, and then this character feeds into the next book in the south of France, and then there will be another character, side character who makes an appearance. And that story, which I have a loose idea of, would take place in Rome, same time period.
I love this. This is exciting stuff. I'm really happy to hear all this.
Yeah. I just, once
Douglas,
I get it done, I'm coming right to you.
Douglas, I'm so happy to read this book from you. And after the previous book, I was kind of wondering what you do next, and you totally surprised me with this because it's very different from the first book. So how do you feel now that your kind of baby has been born, so to speak, and you're kind of like parading it out to the world and doing readings and stuff? How do you feel? Like, does it feel real to you yet?
It definitely feels real. I think I feel afraid of how people are going to look at me after reading this book. And maybe similar to, was it Anthony Michael Hall? Is that what it is? Michael Anthony Hall. I always get the guy who
Yeah.
played Dexter and the guy who was in 16 Candles. I always get their names mixed up.
Yeah, they're very similar. Yeah.
Very similar. But so the story is every time he's in line of the movies or getting froyo or something, people look at him, or at least when they were familiar with Dexter, they'd look at him and kind of do a double take and just let him go in front just because
Yeah.
they associate him with Dexter. And there's a part of me that fears that people are going to look at me and at the line in Froyo and be like, oh, he's the guy who wrote that book. Oh, he's the guy who wrote that book. Oh, you can go first. Like, dude, if that's what's in your head, please go in front of me in the Froyo line.
You don't think it's more likely they're going to go, oh my God, Paul Rudd?
Actually, that is 100% likely. I get that all the time, and I'm totally cool with it. I love Paul Rudd. There was one time, just one time I used it to my advantage, and I was, I don't know, like 24, drunk outside of a bar in San Diego, and there was a line, and my friends were egging me on, like, yeah, just do it. I was like, I can't believe Paul Rudd has to wait in line at this bar. They totally yeah.
Oh my God.
It was also before Paul Rudd was this big. This was so, I mean, I'm surprised it worked at the time, but I've been a Paul Rudd fan for a long time. My wife, I kind of joke with my wife. I say she married me just because of how big of a crush she had on Paul Rudd from Clueless. So
You've not thought about doing a Ant-Man cosplay for Comic-Con?
yeah, I should actually. I definitely should. When I gave myself uh, a bit of a goal with my last book where I was going to post 5 days a week. I was going to read one page a day of of Life Between Seconds, and I was going to
Yeah.
post it to Instagram and TikTok. And I made it a goal, and I didn't stray from it. So I did it. But there was a moment where I commented on somebody's thing, and they commented back, and then I made some quip about whatever they said, and they were like, "Oh my God, Ant-Man." I didn't know if it was serious or not, but I said something along the lines of if I wish my agent was as good as Ant-Man's agent because I don't have an agent.
Awesome. Well, Douglas, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I always enjoy talking to you. I love an excuse to have you on, and I love that the excuse is your wonderful new book. So I can't wait to have you on again and talk to you more. It's always just a distinct pleasure. I want to recommend that everybody go out and get a copy of A Girl in the Ashes. And if they're in Los Angeles, maybe look up and see when Douglas is doing some book signings and go get a book that way. Get a meet him in person. He's just a wonderful guy, and he posts really funny jokes on Facebook all the time.
Also true. That's one of my passions is just going on social media and doing the exact opposite of what other people do on social media. As in, people are terrible on social media. I try not to be.
Yeah, no, you've lifted my spirits on many occasions in the last couple of months. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. That means a lot. And just in case, for your listeners listening, because that's what listeners generally do, they if you show me a copy of your receipt for Girl in the Ashes, I have some cool little tarot cards made that show Odette. I mean, there's really beautiful design that I had somebody whip up. And so you show me, I'll mail it right to you. Just as
That
a
is awesome.
yeah.
I love that so much. Douglas, thank you for being on the podcast. I really had a great time talking to you.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me back. And again, I hope to come back soon with another one.
That's my conversation with the incredible Douglas Weissman. His latest book, Girl in the Ashes, is a must-read, and I highly recommend checking it out. I want to thank Douglas for joining us on the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast today. It's always a pleasure to have him on here, and his new book, The Girl in the Ashes, can be purchased through all major retail outlets and at all better bookstores. You can find the link to purchase it in the bio. Come back next week when we'll be talking with author Letitia Clark. You won't want to miss it. Until then, I'll see you at the library.